Chapter 13 of Jennie Gerhardt by Theodore Dreiser. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Bass met Jennie at the depot in Cleveland and talked hopefully of the prospects. "The first thing is to get work," he began, while the jingling sounds and the changing odors which the city thrust upon her were confusing and almost benumbing her senses. "Get something to do. It doesn't matter what, so long as you get something. If you don't get more than $3 or $4 a week, it will pay the rent. Then, with what George can earn when he comes, and what Pop sends, we can get along all right. It'll be better than being down in that hole," he concluded. "Yes," said Jennie vaguely, her mind so hypnotized by the new display of life about her that she could not bring it forcibly to bear upon the topic under discussion. "I know what you mean. I'll get something." She was much older now in understanding, if not in years. The ordeal through which she had so recently passed had aroused in her a clearer conception of the responsibilities of life. Her mother was always in her mind, her mother and the children. In particular, Martha and Veronica must have a better opportunity to do for themselves than she had had. They should be dressed better. They ought to be kept longer in school. They must have more companionship, more opportunity to broaden their lives. Cleveland, like every other growing city at this time, was crowded with those who were seeking employment. New enterprises were constantly springing up, but those who were seeking to fulfill the duties they provided were invariably in excess of the demand. A stranger coming into the city might walk into a small position of almost any kind on the very day he arrived, and he might as readily wander in search of employment for weeks and even months. Bass suggested the shops and department stores as the first field in which to inquire. The factories and other avenues of employment were to be her second choice. "Don't pass a place, though," he had cautioned her. "If you think there's any chance of getting anything to do, go right in." "What must I say?" asked Jennie nervously. "Tell them you want work. You don't care what you do to begin with." In compliance with this advice, Jennie set out the very first day and was rewarded by some very chilly experiences. Wherever she went, no one seemed to want any help. She applied at the stores, the factories, the little shops that lined the outlying thoroughfares, but was always met by a rebuff. As a last resort, she turned to housework, although she had hoped to avoid that, and studying the want columns, she selected 4 which seemed more promising than the others. To these she decided to apply. One had already been filled when she arrived, but the lady who came to the door was so taken by her appearance that she invited her in and questioned her as to her ability. "I wish you had come a little earlier," she said. "I like you better than I do the girl I have taken. Leave me your address, anyhow." Jennie went away smiling at her reception. She was not quite so youthful-looking as she had been before her recent trouble, but her thinner cheeks and the slightly deeper eyes added to the pensiveness and delicacy of her countenance. She was a model of neatness. Her clothes, all neatly cleaned and ironed before leaving home, gave her a fresh and inviting appearance. There was growth coming to her in the matter of height, but already in appearance and intelligence she looked to be a young woman of 20. Best of all, she was of that naturally sunny disposition which, in spite of toil and privation, kept her always cheerful. Anyone in need of a servant girl or house companion would have been delighted to have had her. The second place at which she applied was a large residence in Euclid Avenue. It seemed far too imposing for anything she might have to offer in the way of services, but having come so far, she decided to make the attempt. The servant who met her at the door directed her to wait a few moments, and finally ushered her into the boudoir of the mistress of the house on the second floor. The latter, a Mrs. Bracebridge, a prepossessing brunette of the conventionally fashionable type, had a keen eye for feminine values, and was impressed rather favorably with Jennie. She talked with her a little while, and finally decided to try her in the general capacity of maid. "I will give you $4 a week, and you can sleep here if you wish," said Mrs. Bracebridge. Jennie explained that she was living with her brother, and would soon have her family with her. "Oh, very well," replied her mistress. "Do as you like about that. Only I expect you to be here promptly." She wished her to remain for the day and to begin her duties at once, and Jennie agreed. Mrs. Bracebridge provided her a dainty cap and apron, and then spent some little time in instructing her in her duties. Her principal work would be to wait on her mistress, to brush her hair and help her dress. She was also to answer the bell, wait on the table if need be, and do any other errand which her mistress might indicate. Mrs. Bracebridge seemed a little hard and formal to her prospective servant, but for all that Jennie admired the dash and go and the obvious executive capacity of her employer. At 8 o'clock that evening Jennie was dismissed for the day. She wondered if she could be of any use in such a household, and marveled that she had got along as well as she had. Her mistress had set her to cleaning her jewelry and boudoir ornaments as an opening task, and though she had worked steadily and diligently, she had not finished by the time she left. She hurried away to her brother's apartment, delighted to be able to report that she had found a situation. Now her mother could come to Cleveland. Now she could have her baby with her. Now they could really begin that new life, which was to be so much better and finer and sweeter than anything they had ever had before. At Bass's suggestion, Jennie wrote her mother to come at once, and a week or so later a suitable house was found and rented. Mrs. Gerhardt, with the aid of the children, packed up the simple belongings of the family, including a single van-load of furniture, and at the end of a fortnight they were on their way to the new home. Mrs. Gerhardt always had had a keen desire for a really comfortable home, solid furniture upholstered and trimmed, a thick, soft carpet of some warm, pleasing color, plenty of chairs, settees, pictures, a lounge, and a piano. She had wanted these nice things all her life, but her circumstances had never been good enough for her hopes to be realized. Still, she did not despair. Some day, maybe, before she died, these things would be added to her, and she would be happy. Perhaps her chance was coming now. Arrived at Cleveland, this feeling of optimism was encouraged by the sight of Jennie's cheerful face. Bass assured her that they would get along all right. He took them out to the house, and George was shown the way to go back to the depot and have the freight looked after. Mrs. Gerhardt had still $50 left out of the money which Senator Brander had sent to Jennie, and with this, a way of getting a little extra furniture on the installment plan was provided. Bass had already paid the first month's rent, and Jennie had spent her evenings for the last few days in washing the windows and floors of this new house and getting it into a state of perfect cleanliness. Now, when the first night fell, they had 2 new mattresses and comfortable spreads upon a clean floor, a new lamp purchased from one of the nearby stores, a single box borrowed by Jennie from a grocery store for cleaning purposes upon which Mrs. Gerhardt could sit, and some sausages and bread to stay them until morning. They talked and planned for the future until 9 o'clock came, when all but Jennie and her mother retired. These 2 talked on, the burden of responsibilities resting on the daughter. Mrs. Gerhardt had come to feel in a way dependent upon her. In the course of a week the entire cottage was in order, with a half a dozen pieces of new furniture, a new carpet, and some necessary kitchen utensils. The most disturbing thing was the need of a new cooking stove, the cost of which added greatly to the bill. The younger children were entered at the public school, but it was decided that George must find some employment. Both Jennie and her mother felt the injustice of this keenly, but knew no way of preventing the sacrifice. "We'll let him go to school next year if we can," said Jennie. Auspiciously as the new life seemed to have begun, the closeness with which their expenses were matching their income was an ever-present menace. Bass, originally very generous in his propositions, soon announced that he felt $4 a week for his room and board to be a sufficient contribution from himself. Jennie gave everything she earned, and protested that she did not stand in need of anything, so long as the baby was properly taken care of. George secured a place as an overgrown cash boy, and brought in $2.50 a week, all of which at first he gladly contributed. Later on, he was allowed the 50 cents for himself as being meet and just. Gerhardt, from his lonely post of labor, contributed $5 by mail, always arguing that a little money ought to be saved in order that his honest debts back in Columbus might be paid. Out of his total income of $15 a week, all of these individuals had to be fed and clothed, the rent paid, coal purchased, and the regular monthly installment of $3 paid on the outstanding furniture bill of $50. How it was done, those comfortable individuals who frequently discuss the social aspects of poverty might well trouble to inform themselves. Rent, coal, and light alone consumed the goodly sum of $20 a month. Food, another unfortunate necessary item, used up 25 more. Clothes, installments, dues, occasional items of medicine, and the like were met out of the remaining $11. How? The ardent imagination of the comfortable reader can guess. It was done, however, and for a time the hopeful members considered that they were doing fairly well. During this period the little family presented a picture of honorable and patient toil, which was interesting to contemplate. Every day Mrs. Gerhardt, who worked like a servant and who received absolutely no compensation, either in clothes, amusements, or anything else, arose in the morning while the others slept and built the fire. Then she took up the task of getting the breakfast. Often, as she moved about noiselessly in her thin, worn slippers, cushioned with pieces of newspaper to make them fit, she looked in on Jennie, Bass, and George, wrapped in their heavy slumbers, and with that divine sympathy which is born in heaven, she wished that they did not need to rise so early or to work so hard. Sometimes she would pause before touching her beloved Jennie, gaze at her white face so calm in sleep, and lament that life had not dealt more kindly with her. Then she would lay her hand gently upon her shoulder and whisper, "Jennie, Jennie," until the weary sleeper would wake. When they arose, breakfast was always ready. When they returned at night, supper was waiting. Each of the children received a due share of Mrs. Gerhardt's attention. The little baby was closely looked after by her. She protested that she needed neither clothes nor shoes, so long as one of the children would run errands for her. Jennie, of all the children, fully understood her mother. She alone strove, with the fullness of a perfect affection, to ease her burden. "Ma, you let me do this." "Now, Ma, I'll tend to that. You go sit down, Ma." These were the everyday expressions of the enduring affection that existed between them. Always there was perfect understanding between Jennie and her mother, and as the days passed, this naturally widened and deepened. Jennie could not bear to think of her as being always confined to the house. Daily she thought, as she worked, of that humble home where her mother was watching and waiting. How she longed to give her those comforts which she had always craved. End of chapter 13. Chapter 14 of Jennie Gerhardt by Theodore Dreiser. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The days spent in the employ of the Bracebridge household were of a broadening character. This great house was a school to Jennie, not only in the matter of dress and manners, but as formulating a theory of existence. Mrs. Bracebridge and her husband were the last word in the matter of self-sufficiency, taste in the matter of appointments, care in the matter of dress, good form in the matter of reception, entertainment, and the various usages of social life. Now and then, apropos of nothing save her own mood, Mrs. Bracebridge would indicate her philosophy of life in an epigram. "Life is a battle, my dear. If you gain anything, you will have to fight for it. In my judgment, it is silly not to take advantage of any aid which will help you to be what you want to be." This while applying a faint suggestion of rouge. Most people are born silly. They are exactly what they are capable of being. I despise lack of taste. It is the worst crime. Most of these worldly wise comments were not given directly to Jennie. She overheard them. But to her quiet and reflective mind they had their import. Like seeds fallen upon good ground, they took root and grew. She began to get a faint perception of hierarchies and powers. They were not for her, perhaps, but they were in the world, and if fortune were kind, one might better one's state. She worked on, wondering, however, just how better fortune might come to her. Who would have her for a wife, knowing her history? How could she ever explain the existence of her child? Her child, the one transcendent, gripping theme of joy and fear. If she could only do something for it, sometime, somehow. For the first winter things went smoothly enough. By the closest economy, the children were clothed and kept in school, the rent paid, and the installments met. Once it looked as though there might be some difficulty about the continuance of the home life, and that was when Gerhardt wrote that he would be home for Christmas. The mill was to close down for a short period at that time. He was naturally anxious to see what the new life of his family at Cleveland was like. Mrs. Gerhardt would have welcomed his return with unalloyed pleasure had it not been for the fear she entertained of his creating a scene. Jennie talked it over with her mother, and Mrs. Gerhardt in turn spoke of it to Bass, whose advice was to brave it out. "Don't worry," he said. "He won't do anything about it. I'll talk to him if he says anything." The scene did occur, but it was not so unpleasant as Mrs. Gerhardt had feared. Gerhardt came home during the afternoon, while Bass, Jennie, and George were at work. Two of the younger children went to the train to meet him. When he entered, Mrs. Gerhardt greeted him affectionately, but she trembled for the discovery which was sure to come. Her suspense was not for long. Gerhardt opened the front bedroom door only a few minutes after he arrived. On the white counterpane of the bed was a pretty child sleeping. He could not but know on the instant whose it was, but he pretended ignorance. "Whose child is that?" he questioned. "It's Jennie," said Mrs. Gerhardt weakly. "When did that come here?" "Not so very long ago," answered the mother nervously. "I guess she is here too," he declared contemptuously, refusing to pronounce her name, a fact which he had already anticipated. "She's working in a family," returned his wife in a pleading tone. "She's doing so well now. She had no place to go. Let her alone." Gerhardt had received a light since he had been away. Certain inexplicable thoughts and feelings had come to him in his religious meditations. In his prayers he had admitted to the all-seeing that he might have done differently by his daughter, yet he could not make up his mind how to treat her for the future. She had committed a great sin. It was impossible to get away from that. When Jennie came home that night, a meeting was unavoidable. Gerhardt saw her coming and pretended to be deeply engaged in a newspaper. Mrs. Gerhardt, who had begged him not to ignore Jennie entirely, trembled for fear he would say or do something which would hurt her feelings. "She is coming now," she said, crossing to the door of the front room where he was sitting, but Gerhardt refused to look up. "Speak to her anyhow," was her last appeal, before the door opened, but he made no reply. When Jennie came in, her mother whispered, "He's in the front room." Jennie paled, put her thumb to her lip, and stood irresolute, not knowing how to meet the situation. "Has he seen?" Jennie paused as she realized from her mother's face and nod that Gerhardt knew of the child's existence. "Go ahead," said Mrs. Gerhardt. "It's all right. He won't say anything." Jennie finally went to the door, and seeing her father, his brow wrinkled, as if in serious but not unkindly thought, she hesitated, but made her way forward. "Papa," she said, unable to formulate a definite sentence. Gerhardt looked up, his grayish-brown eyes a study under their heavy sandy lashes. At the sight of his daughter he weakened internally, but, with the self-adjusted armor of resolve about him, he showed no sign of pleasure at seeing her. All the forces of his conventional understanding of morality and his naturally sympathetic and fatherly disposition were battling within him, but, as in so many cases where the average mind is concerned, convention was temporarily the victor. "Yes," he said. "Won't you forgive me, Papa?" "I do," he returned grimly. She hesitated a moment, and then stepped forward, for what purpose he well understood. "There," he said, pushing her gently away as her lips barely touched his grizzled cheek. It had been a frigid meeting. When Jennie went out into the kitchen after this very trying ordeal, she lifted her eyes to her waiting mother and tried to make it seem as though all had been well, but her emotional disposition got the better of her. "Did he make up to you?" her mother was about to ask, but the words were only half out of her mouth before her daughter sank down into one of the chairs close to the kitchen table, and laying her head on her arm, burst forth into soft, convulsive, inaudible sobs. Now," said Mrs. Gerhardt. "There now, don't cry. What did he say?" It was some time before Jennie recovered herself sufficiently to answer. Her mother tried to treat the situation lightly. "I wouldn't feel bad," she said. "He'll get over it. It's his way." End of chapter 14. Chapter 15 of Jennie Gerhardt by Theodore Dreiser. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The return of Gerhardt brought forward the child's question in all its bearings. He could not help considering it from the standpoint of a grandparent, particularly since it was a human being possessed of a soul. He wondered if it had been baptized. Then he inquired. "No, not yet," said his wife, who had not forgotten this duty, but had been uncertain whether the little one would be welcome in the faith. "No, of course not," sneered Gerhardt, whose opinion of his wife's religious devotion was not any too great. "Such carelessness, such irreligion! That is a fine thing." He thought it over a few moments, and felt that this evil should be corrected at once. "It should be baptized," he said. "Why don't she take it and have it baptized?" Mrs. Gerhardt reminded him that someone would have to stand godfather to the child, and there was no way to have the ceremony performed without confessing the fact that it was without a legitimate father. Gerhardt listened to this, and it quieted him for a few moments, but his religion was something which he could not see put in the background by any such difficulty. How would the Lord look upon quibbling like this? It was not Christian, and it was his duty to attend to the matter. It must be taken forthwith to the church, Jennie himself and his wife accompanying it as sponsors, or, if he did not choose to condescend thus far to his daughter, he must see that it was baptized when she was not present. He brooded over this difficulty, and finally decided that the ceremony should take place on one of these weekdays between Christmas and New Year's, when Jennie would be at her work. This proposal he broached to his wife, and receiving her approval, he made his next announcement. "It has no name," he said. Jennie and her mother had talked over this very matter, and Jennie had expressed a preference for Vesta. Now her mother made bold to suggest it as her own choice. How would Vesta do? Gerhardt heard this with indifference. Secretly, he had settled the question in his own mind. He had a name in store, left over from the halcyon period of his youth, and never opportunity available in the case of his own children. Wilhelmina. Of course, he had no idea of unbending in the least toward his small granddaughter. He merely liked the name, and the child ought to be grateful to get it. With a far-off, gingerly air, he brought forward this first offering upon the altar of natural affection, for offering it was, after all. "That is nice," he said, forgetting his indifference. "But how would Wilhelmina do?" Mrs. Gerhardt did not dare to cross him when he was thus unconsciously weakening. Her woman's tact came to the rescue. "We might give her both names," she compromised. "It makes no difference to me," he replied, drawing back into the shell of opposition from which he had been inadvertently drawn. "Just so she is baptized." Jennie heard of this with pleasure, for she was anxious that the child should have every advantage, religious or otherwise, that it was possible to obtain. She took great pains to starch and iron the clothes it was to wear on the appointed day. Gerhardt sought out the minister of the nearest Lutheran church, a round-headed, thick-set theologian of the most formal type, to whom he stated his errand. "Your grandchild?" inquired the minister. "Yes," said Gerhardt. "Her father is not here." "So," replied the minister, looking at him curiously. Gerhardt was not to be disturbed in his purpose. He explained that he and his wife would bring her. The minister realizing the probable difficulty, did not question him further. "The Church cannot refuse to baptize her so long as you, as grandparents, are willing to stand sponsor for her," he said. Gerhardt came away, hurt by the shadow of disgrace in which he felt himself involved, but satisfied that he had done his duty. Now he would take the child and have it baptized, and when that was over, his present responsibility would cease. When it came to the hour of the baptism, however, he found that another influence was working to guide him into greater interest and responsibility. The stern religion with which he was enraptured, its insistence upon a higher law, was there, and he heard again the precepts which had helped to bind him to his own children. "Is it your intention to educate this child in the knowledge and love of the gospel?" asked the black-gowned minister, as they stood before him in the silent little church whither they had brought the infant. He was reading from the form provided for such occasions. Gerhardt answered, "Yes," and Mrs. Gerhardt added her affirmative. "Do you engage to use all necessary care and diligence, by prayerful instruction, admonition, example, and discipline, that this child may renounce and avoid everything that is evil, and that she may keep God's will and commandments as declared in his sacred word?" The thought flashed through Gerhardt's mind as the words were uttered of how it had fared with his own children. They, too, had been thus sponsored. They, too, had heard his solemn pledge to care for their spiritual welfare. He was silent. "We do," prompted the minister. "We do," repeated Gerhardt and his wife weakly. "Do you now dedicate this child by the rite of baptism unto the Lord, who brought it?" "We do." "And finally, if you can conscientiously declare before God that the faith to which you have assented is your faith, and that the solemn promises you have made are the serious resolutions of your heart, please to announce the same in the presence of God by saying, 'Yes.'" "Yes," they replied. "I baptize thee, Wilhelmina Vesta," concluded the minister, stretching out his hand over her, "in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost. Let us pray." Gerhardt bent his gray head, and followed with humble reverence the beautiful invocation which followed. "Almighty and everlasting God, we adore thee as the great parent of the children of men, as the Father of our spirits, and the former of our bodies. We praise thee for giving existence to this infant, and for preserving her until this day. We bless thee that she is called to virtue and glory, that she has now been dedicated to thee, and brought within the pale of the Christian Church. We thank thee that by the gospel of the Son she is furnished with everything necessary for her spiritual happiness, that it supplies light for her mind and comfort for her heart, encouragement and power to discharge her duty, and the precious hope of mercy and immortality to sustain and make her faithful. And we beseech thee, O most merciful God, that this child may be enlightened and sanctified from her early years by the Holy Spirit, and be everlastingly saved by thy mercy. Direct and bless thy servants, who are entrusted with the care of her in the momentous work of her education. Inspire them with just conception of the absolute necessity of religious instruction and principles. Forbid that they should ever forget that this offspring belongs to thee, and that, if through their criminal neglect or bad example thy reasonable creature be lost, thou wilt require it at their hands. Give them a deep sense of the divinity of her nature, of the worth of her soul, of the dangers to which she will be exposed, of the honor and felicity to which she is capable of ascending with thy blessings, and of the ruin in this world and the misery in the world to come, which springs from wicked passion and conduct. Give them grace to check the first risings of forbidden inclination in her breast, to be her defense against the temptations incident to childhood and youth, and, as she grows up, to enlarge her understanding, and to lead her to an acquaintance with thee and with Jesus Christ, whom thou hast sent. Give them grace to cultivate in her heart a supreme reverence and love for thee, a grateful attachment to the gospel of thy Son, her Savior, a due regard for all its ordinances and institutions, a temper of kindness and goodwill to all mankind, and an invincible love of sincerity and truth. Help them watch continually over her with tender solicitude, to be studious, that by their conversation and deportment her heart may not be corrupted, and at all times to set before her such an example that she may safely tread in their footsteps. If it pleases thee to prolong her days on earth, grant that she may prove an honor and a comfort to her parents and friends, be useful in the world, and find in thy providence an unfailing defense and support. Whether she live, let her live to thee, or whether she die, let her die to thee. And at the great day of account, may she and her parents meet each other with rapture, and rejoice together in thy redeeming love. Through Jesus Christ, forever and ever. Amen. As this solemn admonition was read, a feeling of obligation descended upon the grandfather of this little outcast, a feeling that he was bound to give the tiny creature lying on his wife's arm the care and attention which God in his sacrament had commanded. He bowed his head in utmost reverence, and when the service was concluded and they left the silent church, he was without words to express his feelings. Religion was a consuming thing with him. God was a person, a dominant reality. Religion was not a thing of mere words or of interesting ideas to be listened to on Sunday, but a strong, vital expression of the divine will handed down from a time when men were in personal contact with God. Its fulfillment was a matter of joy and salvation with him, the one consolation of a creature sent to wander in a vale whose explanation was not here but in heaven. Slowly Gerhardt walked on, and as he brooded on the words and the duties which the sacrament involved, the shade of lingering disgust that had possessed him when he had taken the child to the church disappeared, and a feeling of natural affection took its place. However much the daughter had sinned, the infant was not to blame. It was a helpless, puling, tender thing, demanding his sympathy and his love. Gerhardt felt his heart go out to the little child, and yet he could not yield his position all in a moment. "That is a nice man," he said of the minister to his wife, as they walked along, rapidly softening in his conception of his duty. "Yes, he was," agreed Mrs. Gerhardt timidly. "It's a good-sized little church," he continued. "Yes." Gerhardt looked around him, at the street, the houses, the show of brisk life on this sunshiny winter's day, and then finally at the child that his wife was carrying. "She must be heavy," he said, in his characteristic German. "Let me take her." Mrs. Gerhardt, who was rather weary, did not refuse. "There," he said, as he looked at her, and then fixed her comfortably upon his shoulder. "Let us hope she proves worthy of all that has been done today." Mrs. Gerhardt listened, and the meaning in his voice interpreted itself plainly enough. The presence of the child in the house might be the cause of recurring spells of depression and unkind words, but there would be another and greater influence restraining him. There would always be her soul to consider. He would never again be utterly unconscious of her soul. End of chapter 15. Chapter 16 of Jennie Gerhardt by Theodore Dreiser. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. During the remainder of Gerhardt's stay, he was shy in Jennie's presence, and endeavored to act as though he were unconscious of her existence. When the time came for parting, he even went away without bidding her good-bye, telling his wife she might do that for him. But after he was actually on his way back to Youngstown, he regretted the omission. "I might have bade her good-bye," he thought to himself, as the train rumbled heavily along. But it was too late. For the time being, the affairs of the Gerhardt family drifted. Jennie continued her work with Mrs. Bracebridge. Sebastian fixed himself firmly in his clerkship in the cigar store. George was promoted to the noble sum of $3, and then $3.50. It was a narrow, humdrum life the family led. Coal, groceries, shoes, and clothing were the uppermost topics of their conversation. Everyone felt the stress and strain of trying to make ends meet. That which worried Jennie most, and there were many things which weighed upon her sensitive soul, was the outcome of her own life, not so much for herself as for her baby and the family. She could not really see where she fitted in. Who would have me, she asked herself over and over. How was she to dispose of Vesta in the event of a new love affair? Such a contingency was quite possible. She was young, good-looking, and men were inclined to flirt with her, or rather to attempt it. The Bracebridges entertained many masculine guests, and some of them had made unpleasant overtures to her. "My dear, you're a very pretty girl," said one old rake of 50-odd, when she knocked at his door one morning to give him a message from his hostess. "I beg your pardon," she said confusedly, and colored. "Indeed, you're quite sweet, and you needn't beg my pardon. I'd like to talk to you sometime." He attempted to chuck her under the chin, but Jennie hurried away. She would have reported the matter to her mistress, but a nervous shame deterred her. Why would men always be doing this? She thought. Could it be because there was something innately bad about her? An inward corruption that attracted its like. It is a curious characteristic of the non-defensive disposition that it is like a honey jar to flies. Nothing is brought to it, and much is taken away. Around a soft, yielding, unselfish disposition, men swarm naturally. They sense this generosity, this non-protective attitude from afar. A girl like Jennie is like a comfortable fire to the average masculine mind. They gravitate to it, seek its sympathy, yearn to possess it. Hence, she was annoyed by many unwelcome attentions. One day there arrived from Cincinnati a certain Lester Kane, the son of a wholesale carriage builder of great trade distinction in that city and elsewhere throughout the country, who was wont to visit this house frequently in a social way. He was a friend of Mrs. Bracebridge more than of her husband, for the former had been raised in Cincinnati and as a girl had visited at his father's house. She knew his mother, his brother and sisters, and to all intents and purposes socially had always been considered one of the family. "Lester's coming tomorrow, Henry," Jennie heard Mrs. Bracebridge tell her husband. "I had a wire from him this noon. He's such a scamp. I'm going to give him the big east front room upstairs. Be sociable and pay him some attention. His father was so good to me." "I know it," said her husband calmly. "I like Lester. He's the biggest one in that family. But he's too indifferent. He doesn't care enough." "I know, but he's so nice. I do think he's one of the nicest men I ever knew." "I'll be decent to him. Don't I always do pretty well by your people?" "Yes, pretty well." "Oh, I don't know about that," he replied dryly. When this notable person arrived, Jennie was prepared to see someone of more than ordinary importance, and she was not disappointed. There came into the reception hall to greet her mistress a man, perhaps 36 years of age, above the medium in height, clear-eyed, firm-jawed, athletic, direct, and vigorous. He had a deep, resonant voice that carried clearly everywhere. People somehow used to stop and listen, whether they knew him or not. He was simple and abrupt in his speech. "Oh, there you are," he began. "I'm glad to see you again. How's Mr. Bracebridge? How's Fanny?" He asked his questions forcefully, wholeheartedly, and his hostess answered with an equal warmth. "I'm glad to see you, Lester," she said. "George will take your things upstairs. Come up into my room. It's more comfy. How are Grandpa and Louise?" He followed her up the stairs, and Jennie, who had been standing at the head of the stairs listening, felt the magnetic charm of his personality. It seemed, why she could hardly say, that a real personage had arrived. The house was cheerier. The attitude of her mistress was much more complacent. Everybody seemed to feel that something must be done for this man. Jennie went about her work, but the impression persisted. His name ran in her mind, Lester Kane, and he was from Cincinnati. She looked at him now and then on the sly, and felt for the first time in her life an interest in a man on his own account. He was so big, so handsome, so forceful. She wondered what his business was. At the same time, she felt a little dread of him. Once she caught him looking at her with a steady, incisive stare. She quailed inwardly, and took the first opportunity to get out of his presence. Another time he tried to address a few remarks to her, but she pretended that her duties called her away. She knew that often his eyes were on her when her back was turned, and it made her nervous. She wanted to run away from him, although there was no very definite reason why she should do so. As a matter of fact, this man, so superior to Jennie in wealth, education, and social position, felt an instinctive interest in her unusual personality. Like the others, he was attracted by that peculiar softness of her disposition and her preeminent femininity. There was that about her which suggested the luxury of love. He felt as if somehow she could be reached. Why, he could not have said. She did not bear any outward marks of her previous experience. There was no evidence of coquetry about her, but still he felt that he might. He was inclined to make the venture on his first visit, but business called him away. He left after 4 days, and was absent from Cleveland for 3 weeks. Jennie thought he was gone for good, and she experienced a queer sense of relief as well as of regret. Then suddenly he returned. He came apparently unexpected, explaining to Mrs. Bracebridge that business interests again demanded his presence in Cleveland. As he spoke, he looked at Jennie sharply, and she felt as if somehow his presence might also concern her a little. On this second visit, she had various opportunities of seeing him: at breakfast, where she sometimes served; at dinner, when she could see the guests at the table, from the parlor or the sitting-room; and at odd times, when he came to Mrs. Bracebridge's boudoir to talk things over. They were very friendly. "Why don't you settle down, Lester, and get married?" Jennie heard her say to him the second day he was there. "You know it's time." "I know," he replied, "but I'm in no mood for that. I want to browse around a little while yet." "Yes, I know about your browsing. You ought to be ashamed of yourself. Your father is really worried." He chuckled amusedly. "Father doesn't worry much about me. He's got all he can attend to look after the business." Jennie looked at him curiously. She scarcely understood what she was thinking, but this man drew her. If she had realized in what way, she would have fled his presence then and there. Now he was more insistent in his observation of her, addressed an occasional remark to her, engaged her in brief, magnetic conversations. She could not help answering him. He was pleasing to her. Once he came across her in the hall on the second floor, searching in a locker for some linen. They were all alone, Mrs. Bracebridge having gone out to do some morning shopping, and the other servants being below stairs. On this occasion he made short work of the business. He approached her in a commanding, unhesitating, and thoroughly determined way. "I want to talk to you," he said. "Where do you live?" I, she stammered, and blanched perceptibly. "I live on Laurie Street." "What number?" he questioned, as though she were compelled to tell him. She quailed and shook inwardly. 1314, she replied mechanically. He looked into her big, soft blue eyes with his dark, vigorous brown ones. A flash that was hypnotic, significant, insistent passed between them. "You belong to me," he said. "I've been looking for you. When can I see you?" "Oh, you mustn't," she said, her fingers going nervously to her lips. "I can't see you. I... "Oh, I mustn't I? Look here." He took her arm and drew her slightly closer. "You and I might as well understand each other right now. I like you. Do you like me? Say." She looked at him, her eyes wide, filled with wonder, with fear, with a growing terror. "I don't know," she gasped, her lips dry. "Do you?" He fixed her grimly, firmly, with his eyes. "I don't know." "Look at me," he said. "Yes," she replied. He pulled her to him quickly. "I'll talk to you later," he said, and put his lips masterfully to hers. She was horrified, stunned, like a bird in the grasp of a cat. But through it all, something tremendously vital and insistent was speaking to her. He released her with a short laugh. "We won't do any more of this here, but remember, you belong to me," he said, as he turned and walked nonchalantly down the hall. Jennie, in sheer panic, ran to her mistress's room and locked the door behind her. End of chapter 16. Chapter 17 of Jennie Gerhardt by Theodore Dreiser. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The shock of this sudden encounter was so great to Jennie that she was hours in recovering herself. At first she did not understand clearly just what had happened. Out of clear sky, as it were, This astonishing thing had taken place. She had yielded herself to another man. Why, she asked herself, and yet within her own consciousness there was an answer. Though she could not explain her own emotions, she belonged to him temperamentally, and he belonged to her. There is a fate in love and a fate in fight. This strong intellectual bear of a man, son of a wealthy manufacturer, stationed, so far as material conditions were concerned, in a world immensely superior to that in which Jennie moved, was nevertheless instinctively, magnetically, and chemically drawn to this poor serving-maid. She was his natural affinity, though he did not know it, the one woman who answered somehow the biggest need of his nature. Lester Kane had known all sorts of women, rich and poor, the highly bred maidens of his own class, the daughters of the proletariat, but he had never found one who seemed to combine for him the traits of an ideal woman, sympathy, kindliness of judgment, youth, and beauty. Yet this ideal remained fixedly seated in the back of his brain. When the right woman appeared, he intended to take her. He had the notion that, for purposes of marriage, he ought to find this woman on his own plane. For purposes of temporary happiness, he might take her from anywhere, leaving marriage, of course, out of the question. He had no idea of making anything like a serious proposal to a servant girl. But Jennie was different. He had never seen a servant quite like her. And she was ladylike and lovely without appearing to know it. Why, this girl was a rare flower. Why shouldn't he try to seize her? Let us be just to Lester Kane. Let us try to understand him and his position. Not every mind is to be estimated by the weight of a single folly. Not every personality is to be judged by the drag of a single passion. We live in an age in which the impact of materialized forces is well nigh irresistible. The spiritual nature is overwhelmed by the shock, the tremendous and complicated development of our material civilization, the multiplicity and variety of our social forms, the depth, subtlety, and sophistry of our imaginative impressions, gathered, remultiplied, and disseminated by such agencies as the railroad, the express, and the post office, the telephone, the telegraph, the newspaper, and, in short, the whole machinery of social intercourse. These elements of existence combine to produce what may be termed a kaleidoscopic glitter, a dazzling and confusing phantasmagoria of life that wearies and stultifies the mental and moral nature. It induces a sort of intellectual fatigue through which we see the ranks of the victims of insomnia, melancholia, and insanity constantly recruited. Our modern brain-pan does not seem capable as yet of receiving, sorting, and storing the vast army of facts and impressions which present themselves daily. The white light of publicity is too white. We are weighed upon by too many things. It is as if the wisdom of the infinite were struggling to beat itself into finite and cup-big minds. Lester Kane was the natural product of these untoward conditions. His was a naturally observing mind, Rabelaisian in its strength and tendencies, but confused by the multiplicity of things, the vastness of the panorama of life, the glitter of its details, the unsubstantial nature of its forms, the uncertainty of their justification. Born a Catholic, he was no longer a believer in the divine inspiration of Catholicism. Raised a member of the social elect, he had ceased to accept the fetish that birth and station presuppose any innate superiority. Brought up as the heir to a comfortable fortune and expected to marry in his own sphere, he was by no means sure that he wanted marriage on any terms. Of course the conjugal state was an institution. It was established, yes, certainly. But what of it? The whole nation believed in it. True, but other nations believed in polygamy. There were other questions that bothered him, such questions as the belief in a single deity or ruler of the universe, and whether a republican, monarchical, or aristocratic form of government were best. In short, the whole body of things, material, social, and spiritual, had come under the knife of his mental surgery, and had been left but half dissected. Life was not proven to him. Not a single idea of his, unless it were the need of being honest, was finally settled. In all other things he wavered, questioned, procrastinated, leaving to time and to the powers back of the universe the solution of problems that vexed him. Yes, Lester Kane was the natural product of a combination of elements, religious, commercial, social, modified by that pervading atmosphere of liberty in our national life, which is productive of almost uncounted freedom of thought and action. 36 years of age, and apparently a man of vigorous, aggressive, and sound personality, he was nevertheless an essentially animal man, pleasantly veneered by education and environment. Like the hundreds of thousands of Irishmen who, in his father's day, had worked on the railroad tracks, dug in the mines, picked and shoveled in the ditches, and carried up bricks and mortar on the endless structures of a new land, he was strong, hairy, axiomatic, and witty. "Do you want me to come back here next year?" he had asked of Brother Ambrose when, in his 17th year, that ecclesiastical member was about to chastise him for some schoolboy misdemeanor. The other stared at him in astonishment. "Your father will have to look after that," he replied. "Well, my father won't look after it," Lester returned. "If you touch me with that whip, I'll take things into my own hands. I am not committing any punishable offenses, and I am not going to be knocked around any more." Words, unfortunately, did not avail in this case, but a good, vigorous Irish-American wrestle did, in which the whip was broken and the discipline of the school so far impaired that he was compelled to take his clothes and leave. After that, he looked his father in the eye and told him that he was not going to school any more. "I am perfectly willing to jump in and work," he explained. "There's nothing in a classical education for me. Let me go into the office, and I guess I'll pick up enough to carry me through." Old Archibald Kane, keen, single-minded, of unsullied commercial honor, admired his son's determination, and did not attempt to coerce him. "Come down to the office," he said. "Perhaps there is something you can do." Entering upon a business life at the age of 18, Lester had worked faithfully, rising in his father's estimation until now he had come to be, in a way, his personal representative. Whenever there was a contract to be entered upon, an important move to be decided, or a representative of the manufactory to be sent anywhere to consummate a deal, Lester was the agent selected. His father trusted him implicitly, and so diplomatic and earnest was he in the fulfillment of his duties that this trust had never been impaired. "Business is business" was a favorite axiom with him, and the very tone in which he pronounced the words was a reflex of his character and personality. There were molten forces in him, flames, which burst forth now and then, in spite of the fact that he was sure that he had them under control. One of these impulses was a taste for liquor, of which he was perfectly sure he had the upper hand. He drank but very little, he thought, and only in a social way, among friends, never to excess. Another weakness lay in his sensual nature, but here again he believed that he was the master. If he chose to have irregular relations with women, he was capable of deciding where the danger point lay. If men were only guided by a sense of the brevity inherent in all such relationships, there would not be so many troublesome consequences growing out of them. Finally, he flattered himself that he had a grasp upon a right method of living, a method which was nothing more than a quiet acceptance of social conditions as they were, tempered by a little personal judgment as to the right and wrong of individual conduct. Not to fuss and fume, not to cry out about anything, not to be mawkishly sentimental, to be vigorous and sustain your personality intact. Such was his theory of life, and he was satisfied that it was a good one. As to Jennie, his original object in approaching her had been purely selfish, but now that he had asserted his masculine prerogatives, and she had yielded, at least in part, he began to realize that she was no common girl, no toy of the passing hour. There is a time in some men's lives when they unconsciously begin to view feminine youth and beauty not so much in relation to the ideal of happiness, but rather with regard to the social conventions by which they are environed. Must it be, they ask themselves, in speculating concerning the possibility of taking a maiden to wife, that I shall be compelled to swallow the whole social code, make a covenant with society, sign a pledge of abstinence, and give to another a life interest in all my affairs, when I know too well that I am but taking to my arms a variable creature like myself, whose wishes are apt to become insistent and burdensome in proportion to the decrease of her beauty and interest. These are men who, unwilling to risk the manifold contingencies of an authorized connection, are led to consider the advantages of a less binding union, a temporary companionship. They seek to seize the happiness of life without paying the cost of their indulgence. Later on, they think, the more definite and conventional relationship may be established without reproach or the necessity of radical readjustment. Lester Kane was past the youthful love period, and he knew it. The innocence and unsophistication of younger ideals had gone. He wanted the comfort of feminine companionship, but he was more and more disinclined to give up his personal liberty in order to obtain it. He would not wear the social shackles if it were possible to satisfy the needs of his heart and nature and still remain free and unfettered. Of course, he must find the right woman, and in Jennie he believed that he had discovered her. She appealed to him on every side. He had never known anybody quite like her. Marriage was not only impossible but unnecessary. He had only to say, "Come," and she must obey. It was her destiny. Lester thought the matter over calmly, dispassionately. He strolled out to the shabby street where she lived, looked at the humble roof that sheltered her. Her poverty, her narrow and straitened environment touched his heart. Ought he not to treat her generously, fairly, honorably? Then the remembrance of her marvelous beauty swept over him and changed his mood. No, he must possess her, if he could, today, quickly, as soon as possible. It was in that frame of mind that he returned to Mrs. Bracebridge's home from his visit to Laurie Street. End of chapter 17. Chapter 18 of Jennie Gerhardt by Theodore Dreiser. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Jennie was now going through the agony of one who has a varied and complicated problem to confront. Her baby, her father, her brothers, and sisters all rose up to confront her. What was this thing she was doing? Was she allowing herself to slip into another wretched, unsanctified relationship? How was she to explain to her family about this man? He would not marry her, that was sure, if he knew all about her. He would not marry her, anyhow, a man of his station and position. Yet here she was, parleying with him. What ought she to do? She pondered over the problem until evening, deciding first that it was best to run away, but remembering painfully that she had told him where she lived. Then she resolved that she would summon up her courage and refuse him, tell him she wouldn't have anything to do with him. This last solution of the difficulty seemed simple enough in his absence, and she would find work where he could not follow her up so easily. It all seemed simple enough as she put on her things in the evening to go home. Her aggressive lover, however, was not without his own conclusion in this matter. Since leaving Jennie he had thought concisely and to the point. He came to the decision that he must act at once. She might tell her family, she might tell Mrs. Bracebridge, she might leave the city. He wanted to know more of the conditions which surrounded her, and there was only one way to do that. Talk to her. He must persuade her to come and live with him. She would, he thought. She admitted that she liked him. That soft, yielding note in her character, which had originally attracted him, seemed to presage that he could win her without much difficulty if he wished to try. He decided to do so, anyhow, for truly he desired her greatly. At 5:30 he returned to the Bracebridge home to see if she were still there. At 6 he had an opportunity to say to her, unobserved, "I am going to walk home with you. Wait for me at the next corner, will you?" "Yes," she said, a sense of compulsion to do his bidding seizing her. She explained to herself afterward that she ought to talk to him, that she must tell him finally of her decision not to see him again, and this was as good an opportunity as any. At 6:30 he left the house on a pretext, a forgotten engagement, and a little after 7 he was waiting for her in a closed carriage near the appointed spot. He was calm, absolutely satisfied as to the result, and curiously elated beneath a sturdy, shock-proof exterior. It was as if he breathed some fragrant perfume, soft, grateful, entrancing. A few minutes after 8 he saw Jennie coming along. The flare of the gas lamp was not strong, but it gave sufficient light for his eyes to make her out. A wave of sympathy passed over him, for there was a great appeal in her personality. He stepped out as she neared the corner and confronted her. "Come," he said, "and get into this carriage with me. I'll take you home." "No," she replied, "I don't think I ought to." "Come with me. I'll take you home. It's a better way to talk." Once more that sense of dominance on his part, that power of compulsion. She yielded, feeling all the time that she should not. He called out to the cabman, "Anywhere for a little while." When she was seated beside him, he began at once. "Listen to me, Jennie. I want you. Tell me something about yourself." "I have to talk to you," she replied, trying to stick to her original line of defense. "About what?" he inquired, seeking to fathom her expression in the half-light. "I can't go on this way," she murmured nervously. "I can't act this way. You don't know how it all is. I shouldn't have done what I did this morning. I mustn't see you any more. Really, I mustn't." "You didn't do what you did this morning," he remarked paradoxically, seizing on that one particular expression. "I did that. And as for seeing me any more, I'm going to see you." He seized her hand. "You don't know me, but I like you. I'm crazy about you, that's all. You belong to me. Now, listen. I'm going to have you. Are you going to come to me?" "No, no, no," she replied in an agonized voice. "I can't do anything like that, Mr. Kane. Please listen to me. It can't be. You don't know. Oh, you don't know. I can't do what you want. I don't want to. I couldn't, even if I wanted to. You don't know how things are. But I don't want to do anything wrong. I mustn't. I can't. I won't. Oh, no, no, no. Please let me go home." He listened to this troubled, feverish outburst with sympathy, with even a little pity. "What do you mean by you can't?" he asked curiously. "Oh, I can't tell you," she replied. "Please don't ask me. You oughtn't to know. But I mustn't see you any more. It won't do any good." "But you like me," he retorted. "Oh, yes, yes, I do. I can't help that. But you mustn't come near me any more. Please don't." He turned his proposition over in his mind with the solemnity of a judge. He knew that this girl liked him, loved him really, brief as their contact had been, and he was drawn to her, perhaps not irrevocably, but with exceeding strength. What prevented her from yielding, especially since she wanted to? He was curious. "See here, Jennie," he replied, "I hear what you say. I don't know what you mean by can't if you want to. You say you like me. Why can't you come to me? You're my sort. We'll get along beautifully together. You're suited to me, temperamentally. I'd like to have you with me. What makes you say you can't come?" "I can't," she replied. "I can't. I don't want to. I oughtn't. Oh, please don't ask me any more. You don't know. I can't tell you why." She was thinking of her baby. The man had a keen sense of justice and fair play. Above all things, he wanted to be decent in his treatment of people. In this case, he intended to be tender and considerate, and yet he must win her. He turned this over in his mind. "Listen to me," he said finally, still holding her hand. "I may not want you to do anything immediately. I want you to think it over. But you belong to me. You say you care for me. You admitted that this morning. I know you do. Now, why should you stand out against me? I like you, and I can do a lot of things for you. Why not let us be good friends now? Then we can talk the rest of this over later." "But I mustn't do anything wrong," she insisted. "I don't want to. Please don't come near me any more. I can't do what you want." "Now look here," he said, "you don't mean that. Why did you say you liked me? Have you changed your mind? Look at me." She had lowered her eyes. "Look at me. You haven't, have you?" "Oh, no, no, no," she half sobbed, swept by some force beyond her control. "Well, then, why stand out against me? I love you, I tell you. I'm crazy about you. That's why I came back this time. It was to see you." "Was it?" asked Jennie, surprised. "Yes, it was, and I would have come again and again if necessary. I tell you, I'm crazy about you. I've got to have you. Now, tell me you'll come with me." "No, no, no," she pleaded. "I can't. I must work. I want to work. I don't want to do anything wrong. Please don't ask me. You mustn't. You must let me go. Really, you must. I can't do what you want." "Tell me, Jennie," he said, changing the subject. "What does your father do?" "He's a glass blower." "Here in Cleveland?" "No, he works in Youngstown." "Is your mother alive?" "Yes, sir." "You live with her?" "Yes, sir." He smiled at the sir. "Don't say sir to me, sweet," he pleaded in his gruff way, "and don't insist on the Mr. Kane. I'm not Mister to you any more. You belong to me, little girl, me," and he pulled her close to him. "Please don't, Mr. Kane," she pleaded. "Oh, please don't. I can't. You mustn't." But he sealed her lips with his own. "Listen to me, Jennie," he repeated, using his favorite expression. "I tell you, you belong to me. I like you better every moment. I haven't had a chance to know you. I'm not going to give you up. You've got to come to me eventually, and I'm not going to have you working as a lady's maid. You can't stay in that place except for a little while. I'm going to take you somewhere else, and I'm going to leave you some money, do you hear? You have to take it." At the word money she quailed and withdrew her hand. "No, no, no," she repeated. "No, I won't take it." "Yes, you will. Give it to your mother. I'm not trying to buy you. I know what you think, but I'm not. I want to help you. I want to help your family. I know where you live. I saw the place today. How many are there of you?" "6," she answered faintly. The families of the poor, he thought. "Well, you take this from me," he insisted, drawing a purse from his coat, "and I'll see you very soon again. There's no escape, sweet." "No, no," she protested. "I won't. I don't need it. No, you mustn't ask me." He insisted further, but she was firm, and finally he put the money away. "One thing is sure, Jennie, you're not going to escape me," he said soberly. "You'll have to come to me eventually. Don't you know you will? Your own attitude shows that. I'm not going to leave you alone." "Oh, if you only knew the trouble you were causing me." "I'm not causing you any real trouble, am I?" he asked. "Surely not." "Yes, I can never do what you want." You will, he exclaimed eagerly. The bare thought of this prize escaping him heightened his passion. "You'll come to me," and he drew her close in spite of all her protests. "There," he said, when, after the struggle, that mystic something between them spoke again, and she relaxed. Tears were in her eyes, but he did not see them. "Don't you see how it is? You like me too." "I can't," she repeated with a sob. Her evident distress touched him. "You're not crying, little girl, are you?" he asked. She made no answer. "I'm sorry," he went on. "I'll not say anything more tonight. We're almost at your home. I'm leaving tomorrow, but I'll see you again. Yes, I will, sweet. I can't give you up now. I'll do anything in reason to make it easy for you, but I can't. Do you hear?" She shook her head. "Here's where you get out," he said, as the carriage drew up near the corner. He could see the evening lamp gleaming behind the Gerhardt cottage curtains. "Good-bye," he said as she stepped out. "Good-bye," she murmured. "Remember," he said, "this is just the beginning." "Oh, no, no," she pleaded. He looked after her as she walked away. "The beauty!" he exclaimed. Jennie stepped into the house weary, discouraged, ashamed. What had she done? There was no denying that she had compromised herself irretrievably. He would come back. He would come back, and he had offered her money. That was the worst of all. End of chapter 18. Chapter 19 of Jennie Gerhardt by Theodore Dreiser. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The inconclusive nature of this interview, exciting as it was, did not leave any doubt in either Lester Kane's or Jennie's mind. Certainly this was not the end of the affair. Kane knew that he was deeply fascinated. This girl was lovely. She was sweeter than he had had any idea of. Her hesitancy, her repeated protests, her gentle "no, no, no," moved him as music might. Depend upon it, this girl was for him, and he would get her. She was too sweet to let go. What did he care about what his family or what the world might think? It was curious that Kane held the well-founded idea that in time Jennie would yield to him physically, as she had already done spiritually. Just why, he could not say. Something about her, a warm womanhood, a guileless expression of countenance, intimated a sympathy towards sex relationship which had nothing to do with hard, brutal immorality. She was a kind of woman who was made for a man, one man. All her attitude toward sex was bound up with love, tenderness, service. When the one man arrived, she would love him, and she would go to him. That was Jennie, as Lester understood her. He felt it. She would yield to him because he was the one man. On Jennie's part, there was a great sense of complication and of possible disaster. If he followed her, of course he would learn all. She had not told him about Brander because she was still under the vague illusion that, in the end, she might escape. When she left him, she knew that he would come back. She knew, in spite of herself, that she wanted him to do so. Yet she felt that she must not yield. She must go on, leading her straightened, humdrum life. This was her punishment for having made a mistake. She had made her bed, and she must lie on it. The Kane family mansion at Cincinnati, to which Lester returned after leaving Jennie, was an imposing establishment, which contrasted strangely with the Gerhardt home. It was a great, rambling, two-story affair, done after the manner of the French chateau, but in red brick and brownstone. It was set down among flowers and trees, in an almost park-like enclosure, and its very stones spoke of a splendid dignity and of a refined luxury. Old Archibald Kane, the father, had amassed a tremendous fortune, not by grabbing and browbeating and unfair methods, but by seeing a big need and filling it. Early in his life he had realized that America was a growing country. There was going to be a big demand for vehicles, wagons, carriages, drays, and he knew that someone would have to supply them. Having founded a small wagon industry, he had built it up into a great business. He made good wagons, and he sold them at a good profit. It was his theory that most men were honest. He believed that at bottom they wanted honest things, and if you gave them these, they would buy of you, and come back and buy again and again, until you were an influential and rich man. He believed in the measure, heaped full and running over. All through his life, and now in his old age, he enjoyed the respect and approval of everyone who knew him. Archibald Kane, you would hear his competitors say, "Ah, there's a fine man, shrewd but honest. He's a big man." This man was the father of 2 sons and 3 daughters, all healthy, all good-looking, all blessed with exceptional minds, but none of them so generous and forceful as their long-living and big-hearted sire. Robert, the eldest, a man 40 years of age, was his father's right-hand man in financial matters, having a certain hard incisiveness which fitted him for the somewhat sordid details of business life. He was of medium height, of a rather spare build, with a high forehead, slightly inclined to baldness, bright liquid blue eyes, an eagle nose, and thin, firm, even lips. He was a man of few words, rather slow to action and deep of thought. He sat close to his father as vice president of the big company which occupied 2 whole blocks in an outlying section of the city. He was a strong man, a coming man, as his father well knew. Lester, the second boy, was his father's favorite. He was not by any means the financier that Robert was, but he had a larger vision of the subtleties that underlie life. He was softer, more human, more good-natured about everything, and, strangely enough, old Archibald admired and trusted him. He knew he had the bigger vision. Perhaps he turned to Robert when it was a question of some intricate financial problem, but Lester was the most loved as a son. Then there was Amy, 32 years of age, married, handsome, the mother of 1 child, a boy. Imogene, 28, also married, but as yet without children, and Louise, 25, single, the best-looking of the girls, but also the coldest and most critical. She was the most eager of all for social distinction, the most vigorous of all in her love of family prestige, the most desirous that the Kane family should outshine every other. She was proud to think that the family was so well placed socially, and carried herself with an air and a hauteur which was sometimes amusing, sometimes irritating to Lester. He liked her. In a way, she was his favorite sister, but he thought she might take herself with a little less seriousness, and not do the family standing any harm. Mrs. Kane, the mother, was a quiet, refined woman, 60 years of age, who, having come up from comparative poverty with her husband, cared but little for social life. But she loved her children and her husband, and was naively proud of their position and attainments. It was enough for her to shine only in their reflected glory, a good woman, a good wife, and a good mother. Lester arrived at Cincinnati early in the evening and drove at once to his home. An old Irish servitor met him at the door. "Ah, Mr. Lester," he began joyously. "Sure, I'm glad to see you back. I'll take your coat. Yes, yes. It's been fine weather we're having. Yes, yes. The family's all well. Sure, your sister Amy is just after leaving the house with the boy. Your mother's upstairs in her room. Yes, yes." Lester smiled cheerily and went up to his mother's room. In this, which was done in white and gold, overlooked the garden to the south and east, sat Mrs. Kane, a subdued, graceful, quiet woman with smoothly laid gray hair. She looked up when the door opened and laid down the volume she had been reading and rose to greet him. "There you are, Mother," he said, putting his arms around her and kissing her. "How are you?" "Oh, I'm just about the same, Lester. How have you been?" "Fine. I was up with the Bracebridges for a few days again. I had to stop off in Cleveland to see Parsons. They all asked after you." "How is Minnie?" "Just the same. She doesn't change any that I can see. She's just as interested in entertaining as she ever was." "She's a bright girl," remarked his mother, recalling Mrs. Bracebridge as a girl in Cincinnati. "I always liked her. She's so sensible." "She hasn't lost any of that, I can tell you," replied Lester significantly. Mrs. Kane smiled and went on to speak of various family happenings. Imogene's husband was leaving for St. Louis on some errand. Robert's wife was sick with a cold. Old Swingle, the yard watchman at the factory, who had been with Mr. Kane for over 40 years, had died. Her husband was going to the funeral. Lester listened dutifully, albeit a trifle absently. Lester, as he walked down the hall, encountered Louise. Smart was the word for her. She was dressed in a beaded black silk dress, fitting close to her form, with a burst of rubies at her throat, which contrasted effectively with her dark complexion and black hair. Her eyes were black and piercing. "Oh, there you are, Lester," she exclaimed. "When did you get in? Be careful how you kiss me. I'm going out, and I'm all fixed up, even to the powder on my nose. Oh, you bear!" Lester had gripped her firmly and kissed her soundly. She pushed him away with her strong hands. "I didn't brush much of it off," he said. "You can always dust more on with that puff of yours." He passed on to his own room to dress for dinner. Dressing for dinner was a custom that had been adopted by the Kane family in the last few years. Guests had become so common that in a way it was a necessity, and Louise, in particular, made a point of it. Tonight Robert was coming, and Mr. and Mrs. Burnett, old friends of his father and mother, and so, of course, the meal would be a formal one. Lester knew that his father was around somewhere, but he did not trouble to look him up now. He was thinking of his last 2 days in Cleveland and wondering when he would see Jennie again. End of chapter 19. Chapter 20 of Jennie Gerhardt by Theodore Dreiser. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. As Lester came downstairs after making his toilet, he found his father in the library, reading. "Hello, Lester," he said, looking up from his paper over the top of his glasses and extending his hand. "Where do you come from?" "Cleveland," replied his son, shaking hands heartily and smiling. "Robert tells me you've been to New York." "Yes, I was there." "How did you find my old friend Arnold?" "Just about the same," returned Lester. "He doesn't look any older." "I suppose not," said Archibald Kane genially, as if the report were a compliment to his own hardy condition. "He's been a temperate man, a fine old gentleman." He led the way back to the sitting-room, where they chatted over business and home news until the chime of the clock in the hall warned the guest upstairs that dinner had been served. Lester sat down in great comfort amid the splendor of the great Louise Quinn's dining room. He liked this homey home atmosphere, his mother and father and his sisters, the old family friends, so he smiled and was exceedingly genial. Louise announced that the Leverings were going to give a dance on Tuesday, and inquired whether he intended to go. "You know I don't dance," he returned dryly. "Why should I go?" "Don't dance? Won't dance, you mean? You're getting too lazy to move. If Robert is willing to dance occasionally, I think you might." "Robert's got it on me in lightness," Lester replied airily. "And politeness," retorted Louise. "Be that as it may," said Lester. "Don't try to stir up a fight, Louise," observed Robert sagely. After dinner they adjourned to the library, and Robert talked with his brother a little on business. There were some contracts coming up for revision. He wanted to see what suggestions Lester had to make. Louise was going to a party, and the carriage was now announced. "So you are not coming?" she asked, a trifle complainingly. "Too tired," said Lester lightly. "Make my excuses to Mrs. Knowles." "Letty Pace asked about you the other night," Louise called back from the door. "Kind," replied Lester. "I'm greatly obliged." "She's a nice girl, Lester," put in his father, who was standing near the open fire. "I only wish you'd marry her and settle down. You'd have a good wife in her." "She's charming," testified Mrs. Kane. "What is this?" asked Lester jocularly. "A conspiracy? You know I'm not strong on the matrimonial business." "And I well know it," replied his mother semi-seriously. "I wish you were." Lester changed the subject. He really could not stand for this sort of thing any more, he told himself. And as he thought, his mind wandered back to Jennie and her peculiar, "Oh, no, no." There was someone who appealed to him. That was a type of womanhood worth while. Not sophisticated, not self-seeking, not watched over and set like a man-trap in the path of men, but a sweet little girl, sweet as a flower, who was without anybody, apparently, to watch over her. That night in his room he composed a letter which he dated a week later, because he did not want to appear too urgent, and because he could not again leave Cincinnati for at least 2 weeks. My dear Jennie, although it has been a week and I have said nothing, I have not forgotten you, believe me. Was the impression I gave of myself very bad? I will make it better from now on, for I love you, little girl, I really do. There is a flower on my table which reminds me of you very much, white, delicate, beautiful. Your personality, lingering with me, is just that. You are the essence of everything beautiful to me. It is in your power to strew flowers in my path, if you will. But what I want to say here is that I shall be in Cleveland on the 18th, and I shall expect to see you. I arrive Thursday night, and I want you to meet me in the ladies' parlor of the Dornton at noon Friday. Will you? You can lunch with me. You see, I respect your suggestion that I should not call. I will not on condition. These separations are dangerous to good friendship. Write me that you will. I throw myself on your generosity, but I can't take no for an answer, not now. With a world of affection, Lester Kane. He sealed the letter and addressed it. She's a remarkable girl in her way, he thought. She really is. End of chapter 20. Chapter 21 of Jennie Gerhardt by Theodore Dreiser. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The arrival of this letter, coming after a week of silence, and after she had had a chance to think, moved Jennie deeply. What did she want to do? What ought she to do? How did she truly feel about this man? Did she sincerely wish to answer his letter? If she did so, what should she say? Heretofore, all her movements, even the one in which she had sought to sacrifice herself for the sake of Bass and Columbus, had not seemed to involve anyone but herself. Now there seemed to be others to consider, her family above all, her child. The little Vesta was now 18 months of age. She was an interesting child, her large blue eyes and light hair giving promise of a comeliness which would closely approximate that of her mother, while her mental traits indicated a clear and intelligent mind. Mrs. Gerhardt had become very fond of her. Gerhardt had unbended so gradually that his interest was not even yet clearly discernible, but he had a distinct feeling of kindliness toward her. And this readjustment of her father's attitude had aroused in Jennie an ardent desire to so conduct herself that no pain should ever come to him again. Any new folly on her part would not only be base ingratitude to her father, but would tend to injure the prospects of her little one. Her life was a failure, she fancied, but Vesta's was a thing apart. She must do nothing to spoil it. She wondered whether it would not be better to write Lester and explain everything. She had told him that she did not wish to do wrong. Suppose she went on to inform him that she had a child, and beg him to leave her in peace. Would he obey her? She doubted it. Did she really want him to take her at her word? The need of making this confession was a painful thing to Jennie. It caused her to hesitate, to start a letter in which she tried to explain, and then tear it up. Finally, fate intervened in the sudden homecoming of her father, who had been seriously injured by an accident at the glassworks in Youngstown, where he worked. It was on a Wednesday afternoon, in the latter part of August, when a letter came from Gerhardt. But instead of the customary fatherly communication, written in German and enclosing the regular weekly remittance of $5, there was only a brief note written by another hand, and explaining that the day before Gerhardt had received a severe burn on both hands, due to the accidental overturning of a dipper of molten glass. The letter added that he would be home the next morning. "What do you think of that?" exclaimed William, his mouth wide open. "Poor papa," said Veronica, tears welling up in her eyes. Mrs. Gerhardt sat down, clasped her hands in her lap, and stared at the floor. Now what to do, she nervously exclaimed. The possibility that Gerhardt was disabled for life opened long vistas of difficulties, which she had not the courage to contemplate. Bass came home at 6:30, and Jennie at 8. The former heard the news with an astonished face. "Gee, that's tough, isn't it?" he exclaimed. "Did the letter say how bad he was hurt?" "No," replied Mrs. Gerhardt. "Well, I wouldn't worry about it," said Bass easily. "It won't do any good. We'll get along somehow. I wouldn't worry like that if I were you." The truth was, he wouldn't, because his nature was wholly different. Life did not rest heavily upon his shoulders. His brain was not large enough to grasp the significance and weigh the results of things. "I know," said Mrs. Gerhardt, endeavoring to recover herself. "I can't help it, though. To think that just when we were getting along fairly well, this new calamity should be added. It seems sometimes as if we're under a curse. We have so much bad luck." When Jennie came, her mother turned to her instinctively. Here was her one stay. "What's the matter, Ma?" asked Jennie, as she opened the door and observed her mother's face. "What have you been crying about?" Mrs. Gerhardt looked at her, and then turned half away. "Pa had his hands burned," put in Bass solemnly. "He'll be home tomorrow." Jennie turned and stared at him. "His hands burned?" she exclaimed. "Yes," said Bass. "How did it happen?" "A pot of glass was turned over." Jennie looked at her mother, and her eyes dimmed with tears. Instinctively she ran to her and put her arms around her. "Now don't you cry, Ma," she said, barely able to control herself. "Don't you worry. I know how you feel, but we'll get along. Don't cry now." Then her own lips lost their evenness, and she struggled long before she could pluck up courage to contemplate this new disaster. And now, without volition upon her part, there leaped into her consciousness a new and subtly persistent thought. What about Lester's offer of assistance now? What about his declaration of love? Somehow it came back to her, his affection, his personality, his desire to help her, his sympathy, so like that which Brander had shown when Bass was in jail. Was she doomed to a second sacrifice? Did it really make any difference? Wasn't her life a failure already? She thought this over as she looked at her mother sitting there so silent, haggard, and distraught. What a pity, she thought, that her mother must always suffer. Wasn't it a shame that she could never have any real happiness? "I wouldn't feel so badly," she said after a time. "Maybe Papa isn't burned so badly as we think. Did the letter say he'd be home in the morning?" "Yes," said Mrs. Gerhardt, recovering herself. They talked more quietly from now on, and gradually, as the details were exhausted, a kind of dumb peace settled down upon the household. "One of us ought to go to the train to meet him in the morning," said Jennie to Bass. "I will. I guess Miss Bracebridge won't mind." "No," said Bass gloomily. "You mustn't. I can go." He was sour at this new fling of fate, and he looked his feelings. He stalked off gloomily to his room and shut himself in. Jennie and her mother saw the others off to bed, and then sat out in the kitchen talking. "I don't see what's to become of us now," said Mrs. Gerhardt at last, completely overcome by the financial complications which this new calamity had brought about. She looked so weak and helpless that Jennie could hardly contain herself. "Don't worry, Mama dear," she said softly, a peculiar resolve coming into her heart. The world was wide. There was comfort and ease in it, scattered by others with a lavish hand. Surely, surely misfortune could not press so sharply but that they could live. She sat down with her mother, the difficulties of the future seeming to approach with audible and ghastly steps. "What do you suppose will become of us now?" repeated her mother, who saw how her fanciful conception of this Cleveland home had crumbled before her eyes. "Why," said Jennie, who saw clearly and knew what could be done, "it will be all right. I wouldn't worry about it. Something will happen. We'll get something." She realized, as she sat there, that fate had shifted the burden of the situation to her. She must sacrifice herself. There was no other way. Bass met his father at the railway station in the morning. He looked very pale and seemed to have suffered a great deal. His cheeks were slightly sunken, and his bony profile appeared rather gaunt. His hands were heavily bandaged, and altogether he presented such a picture of distress that many people stopped to look at him on the way home from the station. "By chops," he said to Bass, "that was a burn I got. I thought once I couldn't stand the pain any longer. Such pain I had, such pain. By chops, I will never forget it." He related just how the accident had occurred, and said that he did not know whether he would ever be able to use his hands again. The thumb of his right hand and the first 2 fingers of the left had been burned to the bone. The latter had been amputated at the first joint. The thumb he might save, but his hands would be in danger of being stiff. "By chops," he added, "just at the time when I needed the money most. Too bad, too bad." When they reached the house and Mrs. Gerhardt opened the door, the old mill worker, conscious of her voiceless sympathy, began to cry. Mrs. Gerhardt sobbed also. Even Bass lost control of himself for a moment or two, but quickly recovered. The other children wept until Bass called a halt on all of them. "Don't cry now," he said cheeringly. "What's the use of crying? It isn't so bad as all that. You'll be all right again. We can get along." Bass's words had a soothing effect temporarily, and now that her husband was home, Mrs. Gerhardt recovered her composure. Though his hands were bandaged, the mere fact that he could walk and was not otherwise injured was some consolation. He might recover the use of his hands and be able to undertake light work again. Anyway, they would hope for the best. When Jennie came home that night, she wanted to run to her father and lay the treasury of her services and affection at his feet, but she trembled lest he might be as cold to her as formerly. Gerhardt, too, was troubled. Never had he completely recovered from the shame which his daughter had brought upon him. Although he wanted to be kindly, his feelings were so tangled that he hardly knew what to say or do. "Papa," said Jennie, approaching him timidly. Gerhardt looked confused and tried to say something natural, but it was unavailing. The thought of his helplessness, the knowledge of her sorrow, and his own responsiveness to her affection, it was all too much for him. He broke down again and cried helplessly. "Forgive me, Papa," she pleaded. "I'm so sorry. Oh, I'm so sorry." He did not attempt to look at her, but in the swirl of feeling that their meeting created, he thought that he could forgive, and he did. "I have prayed," he said brokenly. "It is all right." When he recovered himself, he felt ashamed of his emotion, but a new relationship of sympathy and of understanding had been established. From that time, although there was always a great reserve between them, Gerhardt tried not to ignore her completely, and she endeavored to show him the simple affection of a daughter, just as in the old days. But while the household was again at peace, there were other cares and burdens to be faced. How were they to get along now, with $5 taken from the weekly budget, and with the cost of Gerhardt's presence added? Bass might have contributed more of his weekly earnings, but he did not feel called upon to do it, and so the small sum of $9 weekly must meet as best it could the current expenses of rent, food, and coal, to say nothing of incidentals, which now began to press very heavily. Gerhardt had to go to the doctor to have his hands dressed daily. George needed a new pair of shoes. Either more money must come from some source, or the family must beg for credit and suffer the old tortures of want. The situation crystallized the half-formed resolve in Jennie's mind. Lester's letter had been left unanswered. The day was drawing near. Should she write? He would help them. Had he not tried to force money on her? She finally decided that it was her duty to avail herself of this proffered assistance. She sat down and wrote him a brief note. She would meet him as he had requested, but he would please not come to the house. She mailed the letter and then waited, with mingled feelings of trepidation and thrilling expectancy, the arrival of the fateful day. End of chapter 21. Chapter 22 of Jennie Gerhardt by Theodore Dreiser. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The fatal Friday came, and Jennie stood face to face with this new and overwhelming complication in her modest scheme of existence. There was really no alternative, she thought. Her own life was a failure. Why go on fighting? If she could make her family happy, if she could give Vesta good education, if she could conceal the true nature of this older story and keep Vesta in the background, perhaps, well, rich men had married poor girls before this, and Lester was very kind. He certainly liked her. At 7 o'clock she went to Mrs. Bracebridge's. At noon she excused herself on the pretext of some work for her mother, and left the house for the hotel. Lester, leaving Cincinnati a few days earlier than he had expected, had failed to receive her reply. He arrived at Cleveland feeling sadly out of tune with the world. He had a lingering hope that a letter from Jennie might be awaiting him at the hotel, but there was no word from her. He was a man not easily wrought up, but tonight he felt depressed, and so went gloomily up to his room and changed his linen. After supper he proceeded to drown his dissatisfaction in a game of billiards with some friends, from whom he did not part until he had taken very much more than his usual amount of alcoholic stimulant. The next morning he arose with a vague idea of abandoning the whole affair, but as the hours elapsed and the time of his appointment drew near, he decided that it might not be unwise to give her one last chance. She might come. Accordingly, while it still lacked a quarter of an hour of the time, he went down into the parlor. Great was his delight when he beheld her sitting in a chair and waiting, the outcome of her acquiescence. He walked briskly up, a satisfied, gratified smile on his face. "So you did come after all," he said, gazing at her with the look of one who has lost and recovered a prize. "What do you mean by not writing me? I thought from the way you neglected me that you had made up your mind not to come at all." "I did write," she replied. "Where?" "To the address you gave me. I wrote 3 days ago." "That explains it. It came too late. You should have written me before. How have you been?" "Oh, all right," she replied. "You don't look it," he said. "You look worried. What's the trouble, Jennie? Nothing's gone wrong out at your house, has there?" It was a fortuitous question. He hardly knew why he had asked it, yet it opened the door to what she wanted to say. "My father's sick," she replied. "What happened to him?" "He burned his hands at the glassworks. We've been terribly worried. It looks as though he would not be able to use them any more." She paused, looking the distress she felt, and he saw plainly that she was facing a crisis. "That's too bad," he said. "That certainly is. When did this happen?" "Oh, almost 3 weeks ago now." "It certainly is bad. Come in to lunch, though. I want to talk with you. I've been wanting to get a better understanding of your family affairs since I left." He led the way into the dining-room and selected a secluded table. He tried to divert her mind by asking her to order the luncheon, but she was too worried and too shy to do so, and he had to make out the menu by himself. Then he turned to her with a cheering air. "Now, Jennie," he said, "I want you to tell me all about your family. I got a little something of it last time, but I want to get it straight. Your father, you said, was a glass-blower by trade. Now he can't work any more at that. That's obvious." "Yes," she said. "How many other children are there?" "6. Are you the oldest?" "No, my brother Sebastian is. He's 22. "And what does he do?" "He's a clerk in a cigar store." "Do you know how much he makes?" "I think it's $12, she replied thoughtfully. "And the other children?" "Martha and Veronica don't do anything yet. They're too young. My brother George works at Wilson's. He's a cash boy. He gets $3.50. "And how much do you make?" "I make 4. He stopped, figuring up mentally just what they had to live on. "How much rent do you pay?" he continued. $12. "How old is your mother?" "She's nearly 50 now." He turned a fork in his hands back and forth. He was thinking earnestly. "To tell you the honest truth, I fancied it was something like that, Jennie," he said. "I've been thinking about you a lot. Now I know. There's only one answer to your problem, and it isn't such a bad one, if you'll only believe me." He paused for an inquiry, but she made none. Her mind was running on her own difficulties. "Don't you want to know?" he inquired. "Yes," she answered mechanically. "It's me," he replied. "You have to let me help you. I wanted to last time. Now you have to. Do you hear?" "I thought I wouldn't," she said simply. "I knew what you thought," he replied. "That's all over now. I'm going to tend to that family of yours, and I'll do it right now, while I think of it." He drew out his purse and extracted several $10 and $20 bills, $250 in all. "I want you to take this," he said. "It's just the beginning. I will see that your family is provided for from now on. Here, give me your hand." "Oh, no," she said, "not so much. Don't give me all that." "Yes," he replied. "Don't argue. Here, give me your hand." She put it out in answer to the summons of his eyes, and he shut her fingers on the money, pressing them gently at the same time. "I want you to have it, sweet. I love you, little girl. I'm not going to see you suffer, nor anyone belonging to you." Her eyes looked a dumb thankfulness, and she bit her lips. "I don't know how to thank you," she said. "You don't need to," he replied. "The thanks are all the other way, believe me." He paused and looked at her, the beauty of her face holding him. She looked at the table, wondering what would come next. "How would you like to leave what you're doing and stay at home?" he asked. "That would give you your freedom daytimes." "I couldn't do that," she replied. "Papa wouldn't allow it. He knows I ought to work." "That's true enough," he said. "But there's so little in what you're doing. Good heavens, $4 a week! I would be glad to give you 50 times that sum if I thought there was any way in which you could use it." He idly thrummed the cloth with his fingers. "I couldn't," she said. "I hardly know how to use this. They'll suspect. I'll have to tell Mama." From the way she said it, he judged, there must be some bond of sympathy between her and her mother which would permit of a confidence such as this. He was by no means a hard man, and the thought touched him. But he would not relinquish his purpose. "There's only one thing to be done as far as I can see," he went on very gently. "You're not suited for the kind of work you're doing. You're too refined. I object to it. Give it up and come with me down to New York. I'll take good care of you. I love you and want you. As far as your family is concerned, you won't have to worry about them any more. You can take a nice home for them and furnish it in any style you please. Wouldn't you like that?" He paused, and Jennie's thoughts reverted quickly to her mother, her dear mother. All her life Mrs. Gerhardt had been talking of this very thing, a nice home. If they could just have a larger house with good furniture and a yard filled with trees, how happy she would be. In such a home she would be free of the care of rent, the discomfort of poor furniture, the wretchedness of poverty. She would be so happy. She hesitated there, while his keen eye followed her in spirit, and he saw what a power he had set in motion. It had been a happy inspiration, the suggestion of a decent home for the family. He waited a few minutes longer, and then said, "Well, wouldn't you better let me do that?" "It would be very nice," she said, "but it can't be done now. I couldn't leave home. Papa would want to know all about where I was going. I wouldn't know what to say." "Why couldn't you pretend that you're going down to New York with Mrs. Bracebridge?" he suggested. "There couldn't be any objection to that, could there?" "Not if they didn't find out," she said, her eyes opening in amazement. "But if they should—" "They won't," he replied calmly. "They're not watching Mrs. Bracebridge's affairs. Plenty of mistresses take their maids on long trips. Why not simply tell them you're invited to go, have to go, and then go?" "Do you think I could?" she inquired. "Certainly," he replied. "What is there peculiar about that?" She thought it over, and the plan did seem feasible. Then she looked at this man and realized the relationship with him meant possible motherhood for her again. The tragedy of giving birth to a child, she could not go through that a second time, at least under the same conditions. She could not bring herself to tell him about Vesta, but she must voice this insurmountable objection. "I," she said, formulating the first word of her sentence, and then stopping. "Yes," he said. "I what?" "I—" She paused again. He loved her shy ways, her sweet, hesitating lips. "What is it, Jennie?" he asked helpfully. "You're so delicious. Can't you tell me?" Her hand was on the table. He reached over and laid his strong brown one on top of it. "I couldn't have a baby," she said finally, and looked down. He gazed at her, and the charm of her frankness, her innate decency under conditions so anomalous, her simple, unaffected recognition of the primal facts of life, lifted her to a plane in his esteem which she had not occupied until that moment. "You're a great girl, Jennie," he said. "You're wonderful. But don't worry about that. It can be arranged. You don't need to have a child unless you want to, and I don't want you to." He saw the question written in her wondering, shamed face. "It's so," he said. "You believe me, don't you? You think I know, don't you?" "Yes," she faltered. "Well, I do, but anyway, I wouldn't let any trouble come to you. I'll take you away. Besides, I don't want any children. There wouldn't be any satisfaction in that proposition for me at this time. I'd rather wait. But there won't be. Don't worry." "Yes," she said faintly. Not for worlds could she have met his eyes. "Look here, Jennie," he said after a time. "You care for me, don't you? You don't think I'd sit here and plead with you if I didn't care for you? I'm crazy about you, and that's the literal truth. You're like wine to me. I want you to come with me. I want you to do it quickly. I know how difficult this family business is, but you can arrange it. Come with me down to New York. We'll work out something later. I'll meet your family. We'll pretend a courtship, anything you like. Only come now." "You don't mean right away, do you?" she asked, startled. "Yes, tomorrow if possible. Monday, sure. You can arrange it. Why, if Miss Bracebridge asked you, you'd go fast enough, and no one would think anything about it. Isn't that so?" "Yes," she admitted slowly. "Well, then, why not now?" "It's always so much harder to work out a falsehood," she replied thoughtfully. "I know it. But you can come, won't you?" "Won't you wait a little while?" she pleaded. "It's so very sudden. I'm afraid." "Not a day, sweet, that I can help. Can't you see how I feel? Look in my eyes, will you?" "Yes," she replied sorrowfully, and yet with a strange thrill of affection. "I will." End of chapter 22. Chapter 23 of Jennie Gerhardt by Theodore Dreiser. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The business of arranging for the sudden departure was really not so difficult as it first appeared. Jennie proposed to tell her mother the whole truth, and there was nothing to say to her father except that she was going with Mrs. Bracebridge at the latter's request. He might question her, but he really could not doubt. Before going home that afternoon, she accompanied Lester to a department store, where she was fitted out with a trunk, a suitcase, and a traveling suit and hat. Lester was very proud of his prize. "When we get to New York, I'm going to get you some real things," he told her. "I'm going to show you what you can be made to look like." He had all the purchased articles packed in the trunk and sent to his hotel. Then he arranged to have Jennie come there and dress Monday for the trip, which began in the afternoon. When she came home, Mrs. Gerhardt, who was in the kitchen, received her with her usual affectionate greeting. "Have you been working very hard?" she asked. "You look tired." "No," she said, "I'm not tired. It isn't that. I just don't feel good." "What's the trouble?" "Oh, I have to tell you something, Mama. It's so hard." She paused, looking inquiringly at her mother, and then away. "Why, what is it?" asked her mother nervously. So many things had happened in the past that she was always on the alert for some new calamity. "You haven't lost your place, have you?" "No," replied Jennie, with an effort to maintain her mental poise. "But I'm going to leave it." "No!" exclaimed her mother. "Why?" "I'm going to New York." Her mother's eyes opened widely. "Why? When did you decide to do that?" she inquired. "Today." "You don't mean it." "Yes, I do, Mama. Listen, I've got something I want to tell you. You know how poor we are. There isn't any way we can make things come out right. I have found someone who wants to help us. He says he loves me, and he wants me to go to New York with him Monday. I've decided to go." "Oh, Jennie," exclaimed her mother, "surely not. You wouldn't do anything like that after all that's happened. Think of your father." "I've thought it all out," went on Jennie firmly. "It's really for the best. He's a good man, I know he is. He has lots of money. He wants me to go with him, and I'd better go. He will take a new house for us when we come back and help us to get along. No one will ever have me as a wife, you know that. It might as well be this way. He loves me, and I love him. Why shouldn't I go?" "Does he know about Vesta?" asked her mother cautiously. "No," said Jennie guiltily. "I thought I'd better not tell him about her. She oughtn't to be brought into it if I can help it." "I'm afraid you're storing up trouble for yourself, Jennie," said her mother. "Don't you think he is sure to find it out sometime?" "I thought maybe that she could be kept here," suggested Jennie, "until she's old enough to go to school. Then maybe I could send her somewhere." "She might," assented her mother. "But don't you think it would be better to tell him now? He won't think any worse of you." "It isn't that. It's her," said Jennie passionately. "I don't want her to be brought into it." Her mother shook her head. "Where did you meet him?" she inquired. "At Mrs. Bracebridge's." "How long ago?" "Oh, it's been almost 2 months now." "And you never said anything about him," protested Mrs. Gerhardt reproachfully. "I didn't know that he cared for me this way," said Jennie defensively. "Why didn't you wait and let him come out here first?" asked her mother. "It will make things so much easier. You can't go and not have your father find out." "I thought I'd say I was going with Mrs. Bracebridge. Papa can't object to my going with her." "No," agreed her mother thoughtfully. The two looked at each other in silence. Mrs. Gerhardt, with her imaginative nature, endeavored to formulate some picture of this new and wonderful personality that had come into Jennie's life. He was wealthy. He wanted to take Jennie. He wanted to give them a good home. What a story! "And he gave me this," put in Jennie, who, with some instinctive psychic faculty, had been following her mother's mood. She opened her dress at the neck and took out the $250. She placed the money in her mother's hands. The latter stared at it wide-eyed. Here was the relief for all her woes: food, clothes, rent, coal, all done up in one small package of green and yellow bills. If there were plenty of money in the house, Gerhardt needn't worry about his burned hands. George and Martha and Veronica could be clothed in comfort and made happy. Jennie could dress better. There would be a future education for Vesta. "Do you think he might ever want to marry you?" asked her mother finally. "I don't know," replied Jennie. "He might. I know he loves me." "Well," said her mother after a long pause, "if you're going to tell your father, you'd better do it right away. He'll think it strange as it is." Jennie realized that she had won. Her mother had acquiesced from sheer force of circumstances. She was sorry, but somehow it seemed to be for the best. "I'll help you out with it," her mother had concluded with a little sigh. The difficulty of telling this lie was very great for Mrs. Gerhardt, but she went through the falsehood with a seeming nonchalance which allayed Gerhardt's suspicions. The children were also told, and when, after the general discussion, Jennie repeated the falsehood to her father, it seemed natural enough. "How long do you think you'll be gone?" he inquired. "About 2 or 3 weeks," she replied. "That's a nice trip," he said. "I came through New York in 1844. It was a small place then compared to what it is now." Secretly he was pleased that Jennie should have this fine chance. Her employer must like her. When Monday came, Jennie bade her parents good-bye and left early, going straight to the Dornton, where Lester awaited her. "So you came," he said gaily, greeting her as she entered the ladies' parlor. "Yes," she said simply. "You are my niece," he went on. "I have engaged H room for you near mine. I'll call for the key, and you go dress. When you're ready, I'll have the trunk sent to the depot. The train leaves at 1 o'clock." She went to her room and dressed, while he fidgeted about, read, smoked, and finally knocked at her door. She replied by opening to him, fully clad. "You look charming," he said with a smile. She looked down, for she was nervous and distraught. The whole process of planning, lying, nerving herself to carry out her part, had been hard on her. She looked tired and worried. "Not grieving, are you?" he asked, seeing how things stood. "No," she replied. "Come now, sweet, you mustn't feel this way. It's coming out all right." He took her in his arms and kissed her, and they strolled down the hall. He was astonished to see how well she looked in even these simple clothes, the best she had ever had. They reached the depot after a short carriage ride. The accommodations had been arranged for beforehand, and Kane had allowed just enough time to make the train. When they settled themselves in a Pullman stateroom, it was with a keen sense of satisfaction on his part. Life looked rosy. Jennie was beside him. He had succeeded in what he had started out to do. So might it always be. As the train rolled out of the depot, and the long reaches of the fields succeeded, Jennie studied them wistfully. There were the forests, leafless and bare, the wide brown fields, wet with the rains of winter, the low farmhouses sitting amid flat stretches of prairie, their low roofs making them look as if they were hugging the ground. The train roared past little hamlets, with cottages of white and yellow and drab, their roofs blackened by frost and rain. Jennie noted one in particular, which seemed to recall the old neighborhood where they used to live at Columbus. She put her handkerchief to her eyes and began silently to cry. "I hope you're not crying, are you, Jennie?" said Lester, looking up suddenly from the letter he had been reading. "Come, come," he went on, as he saw a faint tremor shaking her. "This won't do. You have to do better than this. You'll never get along if you act that way." She made no reply, and the depth of her silent grief filled him with strange sympathies. "Don't cry," he continued soothingly. "Everything will be all right. I told you that. You needn't worry about anything." Jennie made a great effort to recover herself and began to dry her eyes. "You don't want to give way like that," he continued. "It doesn't do you any good. I know how you feel about leaving home, but tears won't help it any. It isn't as if you were going away for good, you know. Besides, you'll be going back shortly. You care for me, don't you, sweet? I'm something." "Yes," she said, and managed to smile back at him. Lester returned to his correspondence, and Jennie fell to thinking of Vesta. It troubled her to realize that she was keeping the secret from one who was already very dear to her. She knew that she ought to tell Lester about the child, but she shrank from the painful necessity. Perhaps, later on, she might find the courage to do it. "I'll have to tell him something," she thought with a sudden upwelling of feeling as regarded the seriousness of this duty. "If I don't do it soon, and I should go and live with him, and he should find it out, he would never forgive me. He might turn me out, and then where would I go? I have no home now. What would I do with Vesta?" She turned to contemplate him, a premonitory wave of terror sweeping over her. But she only saw that imposing and comfort-loving soul quietly reading his letters, his smoothly shaved red cheek and comfortable head and body looking anything but militant or like an avenging nemesis. She was just withdrawing her gaze when he looked up. "Well, have you washed all your sins away?" he inquired merrily. She smiled faintly at the allusion. The touch of fact in it made it slightly piquant. "I expect so," she replied. He turned to some other topic while she looked out the window, the realization that one impulse to tell him had proved unavailing dwelling in her mind. "I'll have to do it shortly," she thought, and consoled herself with the idea that she would surely find courage before long. Their arrival in New York the next day raised the important question in Lester's mind as to where he should stop. New York was a very large place, and he was not in much danger of encountering people who would know him. But he thought it just as well not to take chances. Accordingly, he had the cabman drive them to one of the more exclusive apartment hotels, where he engaged a suite of rooms, and they settled themselves for a stay of 2 or 3 weeks. This atmosphere into which Jennie was now plunged was so wonderful, so illuminating, that she could scarcely believe that this was the same world that she had inhabited before. Kane was no lover of vulgar display. The appointments with which he surrounded himself were always simple and elegant. He knew at a glance what Jennie needed, and bought for her with discrimination and care. And Jennie, a woman, took a keen pleasure in the handsome gowns and pretty fripperies that he lavished upon her. Could this really be Jennie Gerhardt, the washerwoman's daughter? She asked herself, as she gazed in her mirror at the figure of a girl clad in blue velvet, with yellow French lace at her throat and upon her arms. Could these be her feet, clad in soft, shapely shoes at $10 a pair? These her hands adorned with flashing jewels? What wonderful good fortune she was enjoying! And Lester had promised that her mother would share in it. Tears sprang to her eyes at the thought. The dear mother, how she loved her! It was Lester's pleasure in these days to see what he could do to make her look like someone truly worthy of him. He exercised his most careful judgment, and the result surprised even himself. People turned in the halls and the dining rooms and on the street to gaze at Jennie. "A stunning woman that man has with him," was a frequent comment. Despite her altered state, Jennie did not lose her judgment of life or her sense of perspective or proportion. She felt as though life were tentatively loaning her something which would be taken away after a time. There was no petty vanity in her bosom. Lester realized this as he watched her. "You're a big woman in your way," he said. "You'll amount to something. Life hasn't given you much of a deal up to now." He wondered how he could justify this new relationship to his family, should they chance to hear about it. If he should decide to take a home in Chicago or St. Louis, there was such a thought running in his mind. Could he maintain it secretly? Did he want to? He was half persuaded that he really, truly loved her. As the time drew near for their return, he began to counsel her as to her future course of action. "You ought to find some way of introducing me as an acquaintance to your father," he said. "It will ease matters up. I think I'll call. Then if you tell him you're going to marry me, he'll think nothing of it." Jennie thought of Vesta and trembled inwardly, but perhaps her father could be induced to remain silent. Lester had made the wise suggestion that she should retain the clothes she had worn in Cleveland in order that she might wear them home when she reached there. "There won't be any trouble about this other stuff," he said. "I'll have it cared for until we make some other arrangement." It was all very simple and easy. He was a master strategist. Jennie had written her mother almost daily since she had been East. She had enclosed little separate notes to be read by Mrs. Gerhardt only. In one she explained Lester's desire to call, and urged her mother to prepare the way by telling her father that she had met someone who liked her. She spoke of the difficulty concerning Vesta, and her mother at once began to plan a campaign to have Gerhardt hold his peace. There must be no hitch now. Jennie must be given an opportunity to better herself. When she returned, there was great rejoicing. Of course she could not go back to her work, but Mrs. Gerhardt explained that Mrs. Bracebridge had given Jennie a few weeks' vacation in order that she might look for something better, something at which she could make more money. End of chapter 23. Chapter 24 of Jennie Gerhardt by Theodore Dreiser. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The problem of the Gerhardt family and its relationship to himself comparatively settled, Cain betook himself to Cincinnati and to his business duties. He was heartily interested in the immense plant which occupied 2 whole blocks in the outskirts of the city, and its conduct and development was as much a problem and a pleasure to him as to either his father or his brother. He liked to feel that he was a vital part of this great and growing industry. When he saw freight cars going by on the railroads labeled the Cain Manufacturing Company, Cincinnati, or chanced to notice displays of the company's products in the windows of carriage sales companies in the different cities, he was conscious of a warm glow of satisfaction. It was something to be a factor in an institution so stable, so distinguished, so honestly worthwhile. This was all very well, but now Cain was entering upon a new phase of his personal existence. In a word, there was Jennie. He was conscious as he rode towards his home city that he was entering on a relationship which might involve disagreeable consequences. He was a little afraid of his father's attitude. Above all, there was his brother, Robert. Robert was cold and conventional in character, an excellent business man, irreproachable in both his public and in his private life. never overstepping the strict boundaries of legal righteousness. He was neither warm-hearted nor generous. In fact, he would turn any trick which could be speciously, or at best necessitously, recommended to his conscience. How he reasoned, Lester did not know. He could not follow the ramifications of a logic which could combine hard business tactics with moral rigidity, but somehow his brother managed to do it. He's got a Scotch Presbyterian conscience mixed with an Asiatic perception of the main chance, Lester once told somebody, and he had the situation accurately measured. Nevertheless, he could not rout his brother from his position, nor defy him, for he had the public conscience with him. He was in line with convention practically, and perhaps sophisticatedly. The two brothers were outwardly friendly. Inwardly they were far apart. Robert liked Lester well enough personally, but he did not trust his financial judgment, and temperamentally they did not agree as to how life and its affairs should be conducted. Lester had a secret contempt for his brother's chill, persistent chase of the almighty dollar. Robert was sure that Lester's easygoing ways were reprehensible and bound to create trouble sooner or later. In the business they did not quarrel much, but there was not so much chance with the old gentleman still in charge. But there were certain minor difficulties constantly cropping up which showed which way the wind blew. Lester was for building up trade through friendly relationship, concessions, personal contact, and favors. Robert was for pulling everything tight, cutting down the cost of production and offering such financial inducements as would throttle competition. The old manufacturer always did his best to pour oil on these troubled waters, but he foresaw an eventual clash. One or the other would have to get out, or perhaps both. If only you two boys could agree, he used to say. Another thing which disturbed Lester was his father's attitude on the subject of marriage. Lester's marriage, to be specific. Archibald Kane had never ceased to insist on the fact that Lester ought to get married, and that he was making a big mistake in putting it off. All the other children, save Louise, were safely married. Why not his favorite son? It was doing him injury, morally, socially, commercially, that he was sure of. The world expects it of a man in your position, his father had argued from time to time. It makes for social solidity and prestige. You ought to pick out a good woman and raise a family. Where will you be when you get to my time of life if you haven't any children, any home? Well, if the right woman came along, said Lester, I suppose I'd marry her. But she hasn't come along. What do you want me to do? Take anybody? No, not anybody, of course. But there are a lot of good women. You can surely find someone if you try. There's that Pace girl. What about her? You used to like her. I wouldn't drift on this way, Lester. It can't come to any good. His son would only smile. There, father, let it go now. I'll come around sometime, no doubt. I've got to be thirsty when I'm led to water. The old gentleman gave over time and again. It was a sore point with him. He wanted his son to settle down and be a real man of affairs. The fact that such a situation as this might militate against any permanent arrangement with Jennie was obvious even to Lester at this time. He thought out his course of action carefully. Of course, he would not give Jennie up, whatever the possible consequences. But he must be cautious. He must take no unnecessary risk. Could he bring her to Cincinnati? What a scandal if it were ever found out. Could he install her in a nice home somewhere near the city? The family would probably eventually suspect something. Could he take her along on his numerous business journeys? This first one to New York had been successful. Would it always be so? He turned the question over in his mind. The very difficulty gave it zest. Perhaps St. Louis or Pittsburgh or Chicago would be best after all. He went to these places frequently, and particularly to Chicago. He decided finally that it should be Chicago if he could arrange it. He could always make an excuse to run up there, and it was only a night's ride. Yes, Chicago was best. The very size and activity of the city made concealment easy. After 2 weeks' stay at Cincinnati, Lester wrote Jennie that he was coming to Cleveland soon, and she answered that she thought it would be all right for him to call and see her. Her father had been told about him. She felt it unwise to stay about the house, and so had secured a position in a store at $4 a week. He smiled as he thought of her working, and yet the decency and energy of it appealed to him. "She's all right," he said. "She's the best I've come across yet." He ran up to Cleveland the following Saturday, and calling at her place of business, he made an appointment to see her that evening. He was anxious that his introduction as her beau should be gotten over with as quickly as possible. When he did call, the shabbiness of the house and the manifest poverty of the family rather disgusted him, but somehow Jennie seemed as sweet to him as ever. Gerhardt came in the front room after he had been there a few minutes, and shook hands with him, as did also Mrs. Gerhardt, but Lester paid little attention to them. The old German appeared to him to be merely commonplace, the sort of man who was hired by hundreds in common capacities in his father's factory. After some desultory conversation, Lester suggested to Jennie that they should go for a drive. Jennie put on her hat, and together they departed. As a matter of fact, they went to an apartment which he had hired for the storage of her clothes. When she returned at 8 in the evening, the family considered it nothing amiss. End of chapter 24.